Jewish Education in Media is pleased to present L'Chaim, a program that highlights the people, issues, and events of importance to the Jewish community. Now here is your host, Rabbi Mark Golub.
I'm Mark Golub, and most analysts of the American Jewish scene agree that the most critical element in ensuring the future of American Jewry is education. American Jews need to understand and have real knowledge about their Jewish tradition and about their Jewish history. Look, it's why we created JBS. And there are many wonderful educational initiatives in the American Jewish community dedicated to helping Jews learn about a variety of aspects of their Jewishness. And one initiative that's been marvelously successful in providing a setting for intensive study, giving people the opportunity to learn Torah, with a special emphasis on core Jewish values and ideas in an egalitarian setting, is a yeshiva on the Upper West Side of Manhattan known as Mechon Hadar, the Institute of the Splendor of the Torah. Mechon Hadar is devoted to teaching lay leaders, though it also ordains American rabbis. And Mechon Hadar was founded by 3 young creative rabbis in 2006, all of whom we've been privileged to feature on JBS. Ellie Confer, Ethan Tucker, and my very special guest on this edition of L'Chaim, Shai Held, founding president and dean of Mechon Hadar, and one of the leading rabbinic scholars on the American scene today. Shai Held was ordained from JTS, the Jewish Theological Seminary of America, which is the conservative movement's rabbinical school, and Shai also has a PhD from Harvard in religious studies. Shai Held is the author of a wonderful book by one of the great rabbinic minds of the 20th century entitled Abraham Joshua Heschel, The Call of Transcendence, which is a study of the major themes in Rabbi Heschel's writings. And in 2017, Shai Held published a 2-volume collection of essays on the Torah called The Heart of Torah. And whenever and wherever Shai Held lectures or shares his perspectives on Torah, Judaism, those lucky enough to be in attendance are not only in for a real treat, they come away with a greater understanding and appreciation for the beauty and insight of the Jewish tradition. And Shai Held, it is such an honor and privilege for me to have you hit this table. I've wanted you here for a long time. I think you're absolutely out of this world, and I'm thrilled to have you on L'Chaim.
Thank you so much. It's a privilege to be here.
And there's so much I want you to tell me about and our audience to learn about you. First of all, just before we went on the air, when you said to me, you have a story about Abraham Joshua Heschel, The Call of Transcendence. What's the story?
Well, it's just a sweet moment in the life of a Jewish parent. When the first copies of that book arrived, I opened the box and handed a copy to my son, who was 4 at the time. He proceeded to take a copy of the book, sit down on the couch, and stare at it for what felt to me like 10 minutes.
Show me how.
He's just looking, he's looking, he's looking. Finally, he looks up and he says, "Abba, you know, this just doesn't look like you." It was really one of my favorite moments ever. I had to explain to him, that is in fact not me.
Not you. How many children do you have?
I have 3 children, 9 years old, 7 years old, and 3 years old. The lights of my life.
Oh, that is lovely. Their names?
Lev, Maya, and Kobe.
Lovely. And your wife's name?
Is Rachel.
How long have you been married?
11 years.
Mazel tov.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
So, where did you grow up, and in what Jewish home were you raised? Who were your parents Jewishly? Was it Zionist? Was it observant? Tell me about it.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because I always like to say that I grew up in what could have been described as a cognitive dissonance experiment. It was like a home out of the 1860s. My parents were refugees from Europe who had fled as children to Palestine, fought in the Haganah, ended up coming to America to complete their graduate studies in the 50s. They were pioneers both in Aliyah and in Yeridah. They came to America for a year in 1956. Then my father got a series of jobs, and the rest became history. And what was fascinating about my upbringing was that my parents were not observant, but Jewish learning and Jewish culture were everything to them. So my father's narrative in our childhood was, I don't care what you do, but no child of mine will ever grow up to be an ignoramus. No Am Haaretz in my home. And so we were sent to Yeshiva Day School in Monsey. Now, Monsey then was modern Orthodox with Haredi outposts, not Monsey today, which is essentially Haredi with modern Orthodox outposts. But to give you a sense of how strange this was, at the end of 7th grade, I could read classical Jewish texts completely fluidly. Talmud, Rashi, Tosfot, no problem. But I had never seen a Friday night Kiddush, right? So this was amazing, right? I could learn in a Beit Midrash in a traditional Jewish study hall with no problem at all, but I had no sense of what Jewish ritual was. We went to shul 3 days a year. I mean, nobody goes to Yeshiva Day School in Monsey and goes to shul 3 days a year. It was very, very strange. Now, to add to the complexity, my parents, until I was 8, spoke only Hebrew to me. And our identity as a family was that we were kind of cultural Zionists. The great classic Israeli singer Yoram Gaon was the soundtrack of my childhood. That's the music I listened to with my mom.
What are your parents' names?
So you'll appreciate this. My father's name was Shai Held. He was a sort of well-known professor of Bible and Jewish studies.
Where?
At Columbia and at JTS. My mother's first name was Balfoura because her father was a prominent leader of JNF in the Baltic states. He took a pledge to name a son for Lord Balfour. Then he realized that my mother was going to be his last child, and he decided, you know, I don't go back on my word. So he named my mother Balfoura. That's the name she went through the world with.
And what do people call her?
Balfoura.
Really? And
she was insistent on that.
All right. By the way, I should have asked you. Siblings?
I have 2 older siblings.
You're the youngest.
I'm the youngest.
Interesting.
Right. And my parents is also kind of an interesting piece of the story. My parents, when I was a kid, were the age of some of my friends' grandparents. Right? For me to have parents who were refugees from the Holocaust, many of my friends had grandparents who had fled. So it was kind of a fascinating background.
How old were your parents when you were born?
My father
Roughly.
was 48.
That's on the older side.
And my mother was 42, I believe.
Okay.
Yeah. So it was a very kind of strange. Oh, and by the way, and they sent me to conservative summer camp just because why not?
Which one?
Ramah.
Ramah.
So you know what I always like to say is that on a good day, my parents raised me in such a way that I could pass and sort of fit in any Jewish setting. And on a bad day, it meant I would feel at home nowhere. And I don't think it's a surprise, actually, that I ended up co-founding an institution that doesn't exactly fit in the denominational boxes. Because in some ways, I was raised to be that.
That's fascinating. You were uncomfortable at times?
You know, I was uncomfortable. There were moments, I would say, where I felt the sort of fissures in my identity very strongly. You know, a random example. I was drawn to theology from a very young age, maybe not surprisingly. And I remember thinking as a little boy in school, the fundamental story I'm being told here is that God wrote the Bible and gave it to Moses. My father is a Bible professor. I know he thinks that that's just not how it happened. And I used to drive him crazy.
How? Oh, tell me.
Oh, I would walk into his office, study at home, and I would say, so which one is it? Did God write the Torah? Did people write the Torah? And my father, who was really an academic, did not have a philosophical bone in his body, had no idea how to really handle that.
It didn't matter to him.
It didn't matter to him because the Torah was the cultural monument of the Jewish people, and that's what mattered. You know, it's also funny because when I was in around 4th grade, I decided I wanted to be observant, which my parents thought was very strange, but okay. So on Saturday mornings, I would wake up my father so he would turn on the TV for me so I could watch television. And I remember this very vividly, my father saying to me one day, all of this training and all of these years of graduate school so that I could become a Shabbos guy, right? So that I could wake up on Shabbos and wake up the TV for my child, turn on the TV for my child. It was just so funny. But that was my identity. It was a very kind of confusing
It's
in a lot of
fascinating.
ways.
Was there kashrut in your home?
There was ingredients kosher in our home,
Okay, but not strictly kosher.
not hashgacha kosher, not supervised
No.
kosher.
Would you have treif at home?
No,
Okay. And would you have milk and meat at home?
no.
Okay.
One set of dishes.
Yes, fine. And what about
No, sorry, by the way, I don't know if, is that true, one set of dishes? No, 2 sets of dishes, but no changing over dishes for Pesach.
okay, and 2 sets of silverware then?
That's my recollection,
Okay,
yeah.
but what you do know for sure is you would not have milk and meat together in your home.
Right, because that's how Jews eat, right? It wasn't like we were observing God's commandments. Like, that's how Jews eat. Jews don't do this. That was really their identity. Although, on the other hand, Shabbat, we did nothing. I mean,
Nothing? No challah?
nothing.
No candles?
No challah, no candles, no, nothing.
Did you ever talk to your parents about that in retrospect?
I think that there were moments when I kind of expressed confusion about it, but they were not very receptive to that. You know, they were who they were in that way. Although, you know, I'll share with you just because I think it's kind of a fascinating story. I had a conversation with my mother maybe 6 or 7 years before she died, in which she said to me in what for her was a kind of really surprising moment of self-awareness. She said, you know, I'm so angry. This was in Hebrew, of course. I'm so angry that apparently I do believe. Right? She was so angry at God for what had happened to her family that on some level, as she kind of grew older and more frail, she realized that her level of rage, it was kind of like something out of Elie Wiesel, right? It was kind of like, no, I do believe in God because I'm furious at God, and I've been furious my whole adult life.
You know, that's brilliant. That is brilliant of her.
Yeah, and she was
It
not
is
a person who was
profound
self-reflective, and so
well,
it was really
I mean, I get chills from it. That's a remarkable thing, given the way you've described your mother, for your mother to have said. And it does indicate something, Shai, about human nature and how very often we are different people at different ages in our life, and very often it's hard to, you know, people tend to compartmentalize. And I believe even in the Jewish tradition, there are ways where compartmentalization is important. At the same time, there's the overall human being. And what your mother is saying to you at one point is, I've had a certain view of who I am and what life is, and at the same time, I'm aware of the fact that there's an emotional factor that was very much present in me and made me angry. And the question that makes me ask you is, was your mother an angry person in general?
Yes. My mother was an angry person. My mother carried around a tremendous amount of trauma from being a refugee, from having a whole enormous family of aunts and uncles wiped out. You know, my mother had a picture of her nursery school class in Kovna in Lithuania, 25 children and their teachers. And I remember her once handing me the photograph and saying, pointing to 3 children and saying, of all of these people, what survived was the 3 of us. That's it. Mm-hmm. And there was just simmering rage there. Distrust of the broader world, fury at God. I remember when I was in graduate school, when I told my mother I was going to participate in a theology conference in Heidelberg, which would be my first trip to Germany, my first, and to date, my only trip to Germany. You know, she wasn't upset with me so much as mystified. Why would anyone go there? What are you going to do there? We don't belong there. And I'll tell you, you know, how trauma gets passed from one generation to another. I will never forget, I was in the process of checking into my hotel, and I saw a van pass by on the street. And what popped into my mind, kind of totally unwittingly, was, I wonder if there are Jews in the back of that van. Thinking to myself, wow, you know, we all internalize our trauma, you know, this collective trauma of the Jewish people so profoundly, right? It's really like, that's what I learned from her. My mother used to refer to Poland as Beit Kvarot Yehudi. Poland is a Jewish cemetery. It's nothing else. It's not a country. It's a cemetery. There was a tremendous amount of that from my parents.
Was your father angry?
My father was angry but had a lot more self-control. My father had much more, I would say, of a developed, gentle side than my mother.
He was more gentle.
He was more gentle. And, you know, For both of them, it's interesting, you asked about Zionism. My parents are part of a generation where, and I've said this in public and often been misunderstood, so I want to try to say it carefully. For my parents and for some of their friends, Israel sort of filled the hole that God's absence had created. By which I don't mean that they worshipped Israel, but the birth of the state of Israel for them represented some kind of return to sanity in the universe. There was some meaning to the life of the Jews. It wasn't all chaos and bloodshed and horror. And for them, that was enormously grounding. I think my father spent most of his life wishing we could move back. That was very important to him. And in fact, I've never actually spoken about this in a public way, but my father died when I was 12. And the summer that he died, he was in the process of negotiating to move back to Israel to become a professor at Ben Gurion University, where the Bible department, several of the faculty members there were his PhD students. And I've often thought about the fact, had my father not suddenly died that summer, I would have grown up in Omer, small suburb of Beersheba, totally different life story, right? How much of our life is sort of random and, the function of circumstances that, perhaps a certain kind of piety would say, individual providence, but I'm not there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Where exactly were your parents in World War II, and how did they survive the Shoah?
My parents left with their families before the war.
Do you know what year, roughly?
I don't. One of the tragedies of my father dying very young and my mother being unable to talk about a lot of this is that I have far less information than I would like.
Yes.
My father, I believe, left in 1938, and my mother, I'm not sure.
Okay, so they were never in a camp.
They were not in a camp. Their aunts and uncles and relatives died in camps.
Died
in camps.
They lost their family.
Yeah. I mean, there was almost nobody left after the war. And my mother would talk about this whole array of aunts and uncles. And she couldn't talk about them without either breaking down into sobbing or screaming rage. She just was never able to do anything else around that, which I have no judgment about. I mean, it's obviously, was enormously painful. So my parents during the war, my father was in the British Army during World War II and then the Haganah.
Did they tell you stories about the Haganah?
So here's another fascinating piece of Jewish history. My mother never got over the idea that what she did in the Haganah was supposed to be secret. I remember saying to her, "What did you do in the Haganah?" And she said, in this very distinctive way, she would say, "Ma shaya tzarich lasot," whatever needed to be done. And for a while I thought, well, was she like a terrorist? I mean, what is she talking about, right? And I remember asking my aunt, her sister, and I was like, I don't really know exactly what she did either, but it was nothing dramatic. It was just they were trained not to talk. And she never put that down. Never would talk about it.
And you didn't have a chance to talk to your father about it?
No, I did not.
By the way, you lost your father at 12.
Yeah.
And although your parents were not literally in camps, they survived. And there's a discussion in the Jewish community, should your parents be called survivors or not? But whether they were literally called survivors or not, your mother clearly, and your father, were shaped by the Shoah. And
they bore their trauma in every facet of their life.
And now you're their child. I've talked to many people here on L'chaim and also off in private who are the second generation, and they describe there were aspects of their childhood which were difficult, and they understand the extent to which it also had an impact on who they became.
Right.
So I'm asking you, to the extent to which you're comfortable doing so, how do you think it impacted you, the fact that your parents felt and were survivors, and two, that you lost your father at the age of 12, which is, look, it'd be horrible to lose. It's hard to lose a father anytime, but it's one thing to lose a father when one is a grown-up adult. It's another thing to lose a father when one is a child. And that happened to you, Shai. So, the extent to which you're comfortable, what did it do to you? What do you remember about it? How did you experience it?
Well, it's interesting. In ways that are probably not surprising. I mean, I remember the moment of learning about my father's death like it was 15 minutes ago.
What did he die of?
He died in Israel, and there was no autopsy, but they think he died of an aneurysm. He went to sleep on Friday night. was supposed to be at a Shabbat lunch the next day, didn't arrive. The student who was hosting him went to his apartment, didn't find him, eventually climbed in the window.
Bottom line, this was very surprising.
Completely out of the blue.
And he's in his 50s.
He was 60. He was exactly 60.
Okay.
Yeah.
So in terms, even when he was 60, that was young, and it comes out of the blue to you then. And where were you when you learned?
I was at home in Rockland County, and just to sort of really kind of draw out for a minute how tragic and crazy this was. My father had left for Israel to teach one summer session at Ben Gurion and to make the plans for my bar mitzvah. And my bar mitzvah, I mean, this is just the way life worked out. My bar mitzvah was the morning of Shloshim, right? The morning of the 30th day after the funeral was the day of my bar mitzvah. And I still remember waking up that morning and saying to my mother, I'm not interested, not having any bar mitzvah. Why would anyone have a bar mitzvah? I just want to lie in bed for the rest of my life. And, you know, my mother basically said to me, I think your father would really want you to do this. And in fact, you know, obviously I did.
That's a good reason to have done it.
But, you know, when you ask how it affected me, you know, the shorter answer would be to answer how it didn't affect me, right? I could say a lot of things about it. You know, one, in a negative way, your sense of stability and the world being a safe place is irretrievably lost on some level when you're a kid and that happens, right? You have a tremendous sense of the fragility of everything. Now, in my own kind of religious life, my spiritual life, what I have tried to do is to learn compassion. You know, when someone comes to me and wants to talk about loss, it's extremely important to me to really be there. Because I remember how desperately I needed that and how hard it was to find people who wanted to hear it. It was not simple. And I also will say that I was very lucky. I had a series of teachers who were really generous to me, mainly in ways that were quite small, but actually to me felt really large. They saw me and they let me know that they saw me. And that really modeled for me that a major piece of what it means to be a teacher and actually have integrity is the small moments of actually letting someone know that you recognize them, you hear them, you see their pain. So that, you know, has been enormously formative for me. Now, obviously, I'm sure I don't live up to that in every moment, but it's very much an aspiration of mine. You know, and it's hard. You know, there are moments when you've lost your child as a kid and you have a moment with your own kid, there are moments that are extremely redemptive, and there are moments that remind you of how much you missed out on. And those moments are very, very hard, right? They are sometimes even, I would say, searing. I have a moment with my child and I think, I didn't have this, right? And nothing ever makes up for not having that. You find different ways to carry your loss, but the loss is never, you know, obliterated or erased. It is there. It is part of what you are, the fabric of who you are as a person. So, you know, that has stayed with me in all kinds of ways.
We haven't yet discussed in your theological journey, and one of the reasons why I just adore you and have been wanting to speak to you for a long time here on L'chaim is because your interest in the philosophy, theology of the Jewish tradition resonates very much with me, and I want to explore that with you. But my assumption is at 12, you're in a different place. And I'm asking you now, as you look back on it, when you lost your father, did it in any way affect what you felt was your relationship to God at that point? Did you blame God? Were you angry at God that this happened to you and your father?
You know, I would say that there was kind of a few stages in the unfolding of that. At first, it made me become much more observant.
Interesting.
Do
you think?
I needed something to make me feel anchored. It's that sense of kind of being uprooted. You know, this was not exactly the most halachic way to do it, but I remember, you know, standing alone in my room saying Kaddish 3 times a day. It was very important to me to do that. It was very grounding.
Good for you.
And I had the rabbi of the synagogue near my house pick me up on Shabbat morning and bring me with him to shul. I needed that. And my impression is, or at least my memory is, I didn't really allow myself the theological questions until the end of 9th grade, which was 2 years later, when a classmate of mine died in an accident. And then my rage came to the surface, and I was done. I wanted no part of anything. You know, if this is the kind of God there is, why would anyone worship God? Why would anyone pay attention to God? It's a waste of time. I mean, I was done. And obviously I was, you know, deeply affected by the loss of my friend, but it also allowed a certain kind of like protective scab I had developed to be torn off and for some of the pain to come to the surface. You know, that led to kind of a series of phases. There was a lot of roller coastering in my life around belief. You know, there are people who I know and love about whom I can say, I know that what they believed at 18 is what they'll believe at 83. And for me, it's like, I'm not sure I'm going to believe this afternoon, right? It's always in motion. That's also a function of having had the life that I had and the experiences that I had. You know, everything is up for discussion always. But yet it took a while for it to become theological. And then, you know, over time, I came to think about God's involvement in the world differently. But I'm not sure that ever made the feeling of being disappointed by God ever go away. That's a piece of what I live with.
Did it affect your siblings in any way in a similar fashion?
You know, it's interesting, you know, how you can put, anyone who's ever had more than one kid knows, right?
Right.
You could put kids in the same home, same upbringing, and they're completely different. My siblings, I would say it didn't affect them all that much theologically, but the truth is they were never theologically minded. You know, I was a kid, as we talked about, you know, 4th grade, asking my father theological questions. My brother and sister, the sort of education in Muncie, it bounced off of them.
Okay.
It wasn't really their conversation.
Okay.
The one way that it affected my sister in ways that, in retrospect, I was not conscious of it at the time, but in retrospect, affected my passion for the inclusion of women in Jewish ritual life is that I have a very vivid recollection, and I'm sure my sister could tell this story with great pain. We were sitting Shiva in my very secular aunt's apartment in Tel Aviv, and the men who were part of an old German Stiebel came every afternoon for Mincha and Mariv for my siblings and me to say Kaddish. And the first afternoon after the funeral, they were there. And when we said Kaddish at the end of Mincha, my sister began to say it with us. And several of the men began to scream at her and basically said to her, "Telchi lamidbach lefachot," at least go to the kitchen, right? And my sister, it was shattering. It's like, I'm a person too, right? At least go to the kitchen. I literally just buried my father. Why are you yelling at me for some ritual reason? Why would you do that? And I have to be honest, I don't remember how I processed it at the time. But when I think about it now, it makes me incredibly sad about sort of losing sight of what's appropriate and what's inappropriate in the context of a religious life, and also a little bit angry for her, like to feel humiliated for being a woman in that moment, or being a girl.
What's your sister's name?
Dalit.
I'm angry for I'm angry for Dalit. I don't even know her. That is.
It was a very bad moment.
It is the
moment.
worst of what this wonderful Jewish tradition has to offer. It's just the worst. And our audience should understand, halakhically, women don't say Kaddish. That's become an issue, by the way, for many women in many contexts. It makes no sense to me. I don't understand it halakhically at all, but it's part of the Jewish tradition. Women don't say Kaddish. And so what happened to your sister was men who thought it was inappropriate for your sister to be saying Kaddish wanted her to leave the room. And they didn't do it in a nice menschlichkeit way.
Right. They didn't go up to her afterwards and say, you know, it would make us more comfortable if maybe you could stand somewhere else.
Yeah.
Right?
I would still be outraged.
100%. But it was crude is what it was. And I'll tell you what makes it more complicated for me, Mark. In all honesty, what's hard is the way people can, you know, and we all know this about ourselves, I think, if we're honest. We're capable of great kindness and incredible crudeness within 2 minutes of each other. Here they were, coming to a stranger's home to enable children to say Kaddish for their father. It's an act of great kindness. It's an act of chesed, right? Of real generosity. and at the same moment, it was an act of abuse, right? And those two things were both true.
Except they didn't realize it was abuse.
They didn't know that, right?
You know?
But part of that is about not seeing
Yes.
the child in front
The
of them.
other
My sister was a
person.
child. Yeah.
So the last part of this is, your mother was very angry at God to begin with. Now she loses her husband, and she has young children, and she's alone. Does it make her angrier? Do you think she in some way changed her own view of the world as a result of your father's death?
Yeah, it certainly makes her angrier. She was always a person who was quite volatile. It makes her more volatile. And she has a kind of perpetual sense of the world has been cruelly unfair to her. What she's not able to do at all is try to comfort her kids.
She cannot do that?
She cannot do that.
She was not a comfort to you when you lost your father?
She is way... I don't want to put this in a judgmental way, but she's so utterly swept up in her own loss.
Yeah, it's not her fault.
She has no room for her kids, not in those ways.
That's
No.
It's a very smart way of saying it. It's a question of, is there room? And there was no room. Without embarrassing you, every time I've experienced you, even this short time we've been talking today, you are a very gentle, sweet person. And it's interesting to me that you describe how angry your parents were, and then you describe some very hard things that happened to you. And again, without embarrassing you, but you know, I have now asked you to be analytical even about yourself. As you look at yourself, and I have not met your wife, so I don't know the extent to which she also has, but my imagination is you're both soft, lovely people.
Thank you.
How did that happen, given the pain you experienced throughout your life?
That's a very powerful question and a really difficult question. So I think I would say a couple things. One is I was always, from a very young age, just sort of a very emotionally sensitive person. The other is living with a mother who was in many ways deeply unstable. I had to become a caretaker and a reader of other people's emotions very young. I took care of my mother more than she took care of me. And that meant I had to constantly be attuned to sort of what she was experiencing, which taught me a tremendous amount that has served me incredibly well in life and was also totally unfair and in many ways horrible, right? Because as a 12-year-old who's just lost his father, your job should not be taking care of your mother. Your job is for her to remember that you're a child and need care. You know, it is what it is. I also would say, you know, to return to something I said a little while ago, I had moments with teachers who really saw me, and those moments landed in a very deep place with me. They sort of taught me, you know, what kind of person am I supposed to be in the world? And what I would say ultimately about your question is that I have tried very hard. I don't want this to sound self-aggrandizing. I don't mean it that way at all, but I have tried very hard to become the person who I needed to take care of me when I was a kid. Right? I've tried to become the kind of parent I didn't have. I've tried to become the kind of rabbi who in many ways I didn't have. I've tried to become the kind of pastor I needed but no one provided me with. And it's, you know, it's always sad to say, you know, my parents were very positive role models for me in certain ways and negative role models in other ways, things that they were not capable of emotionally. And again, I might say I understand where that came from, but it was not any way to run a family. And I work incredibly hard to sort of give my kids emotional language, help them understand what it's like, you know, to manage your feelings, to know how to calm yourself, to, psychologists would say, to sort of regulate your emotions. And I work really hard with my kids on empathy, right? On, you know, it's really important to me when my kids have a conflict, not to revert to apologize to each other, but actually to say, you know, what do you think your sister feels like when you say that to her? What is that? is it like to be spoken to the way you're speaking to her right now? Now, will that work in the long term? I don't know.
Yes, it will.
I don't know, but
Your
that's
children are very lucky.
that's the project anyway. But I think the question is very astute and very painful. I sometimes like to say that there are two ways to learn compassion, one of which is far better than the other. One is to have it modeled for you, and the other is to have it not modeled for you. And in Judaism, I think you have that, the notion that we learn compassion from God's positive model and from the Egyptians' negative model. It's sort of like whether you had wonderful role models or terrible role models, you're supposed to learn compassion. That's a very powerful vision.
Yes, I like the good role model better.
Agreed. I
Yes.
wish I had it.
Yes.
Although I will say, it's funny, my father, there were moments when I saw his great capacity for compassion. He was not, as a consequence of being the generation he was and the traumas that he went through, he could not really regulate his own feelings very well, but I saw it. My father was a professor at an Ivy League university whose students, I remember, one of my father's students showing up at our home in the middle of the night one night saying, my wife just left, I don't have anywhere to go. He moved into our house.
He came to your father.
Yeah, he literally just moved. My mother made a bed for him. He stayed in our house for a month. My father was really a very special person in that way, in a very kind of understated kind of way. He would never have advertised that about himself. I don't think that was his self-understanding, but I saw it. I saw that side of him, but I also lost him very young.
Yes. All right, take a moment to do the other thread, being the child of a survivor or survivors.
Survivors, right. That's really hard. On one level, what I would say is, all of us who had parents who carried around that much trauma, I think spend our lives discovering the countless ways that trauma reverberates. I think that I also grew up with a very acute sense of the reality of anti-Semitism. And I'll tell you what's interesting. I'm 48. I work mainly with young adults. And one of the things that I've seen over the course of my career, this has changed now with the reemergence and the greater assertiveness of white supremacist discourse in America. But I would say that, one of the gaps that I always felt between me and my students, the younger they got, was they didn't have, most of them, a sense of the reality of anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism was a historical concept to them. And, it was one of the the complexities of American-Jewish relationship with Israel require many hours to unpack. And I think, the less ideological we can be about that, in some ways, the more productive we can be in trying to really understand all the different pieces of that. But one of the things that I really saw was that the lack of really understanding firsthand what the experience and reality of anti-Semitism was. Now, I think that's changing with the students I have now, who have Pittsburgh etched in their mind, right? The America that they feel right now is not the America that my students 5 years ago felt.
Okay. And I'm sorry, I've lost the...
You lost my thread here?
Yes. In what way does this relate to the question, what was it like to grow up
sorry.
as children?
Okay.
Child of
So
survivors?
what I was saying is that you grow up the child of survivors, you have an extremely keen and alive sense of anti-Semitism. It's not some memory of Jewish experience. It's like right there. It's part of dinner table conversation.
Even if you don't experience it personally?
I don't want to universalize. In my experience, absolutely. I internalized. I'll tell you a bizarre story from my childhood. I remember I was probably in 5th grade, getting off the school bus, which dropped me off on the corner of the block that I lived on. And I had this flashing thought in my head. I hope I'm not kidnapped by a Catholic priest. And I even remember then thinking to myself, what? I hope I'm not kidnapped by a Catholic priest in Spring Valley in 1977? Like, what are you talking about, right? Even as a little kid, I was like, that's bizarre. And yet it was like it was a raw fear. And that was my parents. That was sort of like the unspoken air of like, we're not safe. I remember thinking once, as a little boy, the walls of my house are a fortress. They're going to keep the Goyim from getting me. I mean, this is Rockland County in the 1970s, right? And my parents, just to be clear, they never spoke like that, right? They didn't tell me be afraid, but they just carried around so much trauma that, like, you drink it, you absorb it. And look, you also ideally put some of it down, and I have. Some, not all. But so what I was saying about some of my students is that was the age gap I felt, so that many of them, most of them did not feel that.
Mm-hmm. But most people don't feel what you described because, again, they don't come from a family that has that etched into their family history.
Look, I think it's also one of the reasons why how we treat refugees is so important to me. Because my parents were refugees, you know, who made a new life here. And even though they constantly, I thought, at least that's how I perceived it, felt sort of worried and scared, they were safe, actually. I don't take that lightly or for granted.
Absolutely.
I think also, look, you know, it also made, it's hard for me to disentangle what was the post-Holocaust memory and what was being raised explicitly to be a cultural Zionist. But my sort of lifelong preoccupation with Israel in some ways was a function of that. Because again, I knew that Israel made their world as whole as it was going to get. In retrospect, that wasn't always healthy, right? It sort of meant that Israel was playing a role that no merely human reality could live up to. Mm-hmm. Israel was on some level just a country. Mm-hmm. But it wasn't that for them. It was, oh, there is meaning in the world, right? The world is not just horrors. It's also dreams. It's also recovery. It's also healing.
And that's true. There's truth to everything you say
totally.
Here.
Yeah, it's right. It was very complex.
It is not, you can't worship Israel. At the same time, what it said about Jewish life was miraculous. At what point do you decide you want to be a rabbi? And how does that, you know, flow out of everything you've experienced and been able to talk about with me here? How do you, you remember that? You know, people ask me all the time, Mark, when did you decide to become a rabbi? So I'm sure I'm not the first person to ask you, but I do, and I have my own answer to that question when I'm asked. But I don't have, each of us, you know, everybody, I was with somebody just this past weekend, they said to me, every family has its story. It's just its own story. So everybody has a story.
Right.
Your story is just riveting. But in terms of your story, at what point does Shai Held decide he wants to be a rabbi? You want to go to JTS and become a rabbi?
Yeah, so, well, let me answer the why did I want to be a rabbi, or when did I want to be a rabbi,
okay.
and then the JTS, which is a separate question in a way.
Interesting.
You know, as I said, you know, from the time I was a little kid, questions of theology, often in a very crude way, you know, what is a third grader's theology? Who wrote the Torah? You know, that was, you know, those questions always spoke to me. And as I got older, I experienced two things. Number one, a kind of frustration that the kinds of conversations that I wanted, I couldn't find people to have with me in the ways that I wanted to have them. And number two, that in a way that was pure grace, like I did nothing to earn this. When I would talk about those questions, people would want to listen. And I remember thinking, like, it's sort of odd. Like, what? Like, I'm talking to a friend at Hillel over dinner, and like all these people are coming to sit down. Like, what is happening here? Like, I didn't do anything here. It's total, like, you know, it's a grace. I don't know. And over time, I realized, you know, I can't imagine anything I would rather do more than spend my life thinking about these questions and giving other people language for thinking about them. And you know, when I looked at the American Jewish community, and I wouldn't have had this language back then, but when I looked at the American Jewish community, I realized this is a community that had been given, and still has been given, no language for thinking about God. No language. For all the beautiful, wonderful, heart-giving work that rabbis did, that was not work that many of them did, giving Jews language.
Yes, but in part because very few rabbis are honest. You're honest. By the way, the guy you wrote about came as close as anybody I've ever experienced. And yet there's something you have done that takes him a step further, which is a great tribute to you. But part of the reason why, and I think you're 100% correct, that many, many rabbis, and this does not mean that they're not good people and they have other strengths, but they don't tell the truth about how they really feel about God because they think their congregations won't like it. And they think their congregations want them to be have a certain kind of theological stance, which I know they don't have. And you had a much more sophisticated view earlier. I mean, that was a gift also. Somehow, who knows how, this became a preoccupation of yours as a child. Because it was a preoccupation of yours, you developed a much more sophisticated grappling with it that enabled you to sit at a Hillel dinner and people are all around you, and boy, I can imagine it, I understand it. My only regret is that I wasn't in that group listening and going with you. But what college?
Harvard.
You're at Harvard, undergraduate? Because I know you have a PhD from Harvard.
Yeah, I
So you
spent
were
a lot of years there.
All right, you were undergraduate
I was also a
Harvard.
Hillel rabbi there.
That's right. So there you are, you're an undergraduate at Harvard, sitting at a table of Hillel, and people are around you interested in your theological, journeys, yes?
Yeah. Of course, in retrospect, when I look back on what I thought then about the world, I'm embarrassed, but it doesn't matter. Right, that's not really the point.
That's right.
Right. Yeah, so it's two things, really. It's that I want to help people have the language for thinking about these questions. I want to think about these questions. And then in a very different register, I want to be the rabbi that I was looking for. And when I started Hadar, when I co-founded Hadar with my colleagues, it was very clear to me, I want to create the institution that I looked for as a young man and didn't find. So that whoever the Shai Held is, who's 19 years old, who needs a Beit Midrash, a place of study where no question is off limits, where no human experience is run out of the room because it's threatening to the teachers, I want them to be able to come here. This space belongs to them. Because I had, it's funny, I saw the best and the worst of what rabbis were capable of growing up. I had teachers, as I have said, a couple times already, who were kind and generous and made space for me. And I also had teachers who tried to silence my questions in ways that were often quite brutal, verbally brutal, emotionally brutalizing. And I'm not sure I could have articulated it when I was getting ready to go to rabbinical school, but not long afterwards, it was clear to me that what I wanted to do was sort of have the next Shai Held have a rabbi they could talk to, and have a place where they could learn and not feel like they had to make a choice between their own experience of the world and their learning, where their experience of the world would be mined for the Torah that it might teach, for the light that it might shed on Torah. That's like really fundamental to how I imagine what Hadar is. Now, going to JTS, I'll just add, it's interesting. I spent my years in college identifying as, I was never really drawn to denominational labels, but identifying as kind of very left-wing Orthodox. And I reached a point during my senior year of college, and I'm not totally sure where it came from, although years later I wonder whether it came from that moment with my sister that I've already described, of feeling like there is a degree of, to me at least, incoherence to this practice. If I walked in to a law firm and women were told to sit behind a wall and not say anything, I would have a civil rights rally. And then I go to shul and I act like that's fine. At the end of the day, that can only lead to cynicism, either about my own values or about Judaism. And there was like a long process where I thought, okay, I'll just go to an Orthodox institution and I'll keep quiet until I'm ordained. And then I realized, Shai Held, you are a very angry 22-year-old. Like, you're very vocal. You're going to go somewhere and be quiet for 5 years. Good luck. Let's try 5 weeks. Wasn't going to happen. I remember actually reaching out to someone I had become very close to, Rabbi Yitz Greenberg, and saying, what do I do? I identify as liberal Orthodox, but I can't. And he had said something to me that I remember this conversation very vividly. He said, you know, I was very lucky. I was ordained as a teenager. I was ordained before I knew anything, right? So by the time I discovered the world, I was already a rabbi. You discovered the world before you became a rabbi. That makes it much harder. And kind of a long story short, I decided to go to JTS, which for me at the time was a very complex experience. On the one hand, it was such a breath of fresh air intellectually. I could say what I thought. There was nothing I couldn't say. On the other hand, what ignited me about life in Orthodox yeshivas, I didn't feel it there. I think JTS has changed a lot. It's much stronger in those ways than it was when I was a student. It obviously is, you know, has its struggles, but in some ways I ended up in my own journey feeling like, okay, why is it not possible to create an institution with all of the religious fire of a traditional yeshiva and all of the openness of a place that values philosophy, that values general culture, that sees academic Jewish studies as a tool in the pursuit of Torah? I thought to myself, it is possible. It has to be possible. And that's what Hadar is.
That's
at its
what
best.
drove you. And
Yeah.
well, mazal tov to you.
Thank you.
I want you to end with this question. It comes back to your father, a biblical scholar. It comes to you, back to you, as it's clear to me, whether it was from the 4th grade on, for all I know, it was when you were a 4-year-old on. All of this, the rabbis describe it as a flight of imagination that the Midrash has, but you seem to embody this in your entire life, that you're grappling with, on the one hand, ideas, on the other hand, concepts, on the other hand, images, but it's all about the same thing. How do you, as a Jew, somehow come to terms with the world and the fact that we live in a very complicated, painful, spectacular, glorious world? I want you to talk for one moment to the audience. I want you to talk to them why, from all of your journey, what's it mean for Shai Held to say he loves Torah and the study of Torah, which is at the heart of Hadar Institute? Talk to the audience.
I want to share that the reason it is hard for me to answer the question of what it means to love Torah is it is to me parallel to answering the question of what it means to love a parent or a spouse or a child. What it means to love Torah is to be intimate with it, to have my waking thoughts shaped by, conversation with, exchange with, struggle with the sum total of things that God and the Jewish people have said to and about each other. There's something about that conversation that feels to me like an immense privilege. You know, there is a verse in Psalms that takes my breath away every time. It says, were it not for your Torah, you are, meaning God, were it not for your Torah, I would perish in my affliction. And in ways that are far beyond discursive explanation, I feel that in my bones. Were it not for the Torah, I would perish in my affliction. I hope that in my work and in my life, just a little bit of that is contagious.
Yasher Koach.
Thank
By
you
the
so
way,
much.
all kol kavod to Moshe and Balfora. Whatever problems, you know, all of our parents are just people. Your parents were just people. They did one heck of a job.
Thank you.
Because your neshama, your soul is out of this world.
Thank you.
You may now rest for a moment. We're going to pause for a second.
Great.
And we'll continue. I have the great pleasure of speaking with Shai Held, Rabbi, Doctor of Religious Studies, President, Dean, and Chair in Jewish Thought at Yeshivat Hadar in New York City. That's part 1 of my discussion with him. I hope you're with us for part 2. You can tell he is a very unusual, special human being and a great, great rabbi. As always, I invite you to be in touch with me with any thoughts or comments you may have to any of the ideas expressed on this edition of L'Chaim. Please email me, write me, post on our Facebook wall, or tweet me. I look forward to hearing from many of you. And remember, if you want to hear this again, you can now listen to all L'Chaim programs on podcast. Just go wherever you listen to podcasts. Google Play, iTunes, whatever, and find the L'chaim podcast. Until the next time, and I hope you're with us for part 2 of my meeting with a very special man, Shai Held. I'm Mark Golub. L'chaim, my friends, to life.
L'chaim is a presentation of Jewish education in media.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more. Simply visit the JBS website at jbstv.org and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please, indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check to JBS, P.O. Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.